Why hello there, and welcome back to Let's Make Us a Character. And in this episode, we'll be Let's Making Us a Character for Metamorphosis Alpha, published by TSR in 1976, 2 years after Dungeons & Dragons, and 2 years before Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And cited by many, including its creator, as the first science fiction role-playing game, but also cited by many others as the second science fiction role-playing game after Starfaring, but only by a matter of like 3 months, and also, who cares if it's the first? Aside from being a thing to put in a YouTube thumbnail, being first is significantly less important than being influential. Like, you probably clicked on this video because you've heard of Metamorphosis Alpha, and likely just learned about Starfaring right now. So, what is Metamorphosis Alpha, and why is it so important? Metamorphosis Alpha is a game set on a giant Earth colony ship, where an encounter with space radiation has thrown everything into chaos, and now, generations later, the survivors have reverted into living in tribal societies and largely forgotten about the fact that they are on a very big spaceship. So, similar to the Starlost, or Universe. More like Universe, because of the mutants. So it is a game of people exploring a ruined, familiar yet unknown environment, fighting wacky mutants, and finding pieces of lost technology, and if that sounds familiar, yeah, I will be bringing that up later. However, the thing that I think really distinguishes Metamorphosis Alpha from later games is the setting. The entire game takes place on this giant ship, the Warden, a 50-mile long, 25-mile wide, 8.5-mile tall arc ship, which is then divided into 17 different levels, all of which contain different things for different purposes. And yes, that is a very big ship, but not like that big in the context of being a setting for a game. At most points, you can travel the width of the ship from one side to the other in a single day. But then, of course, you can also find yourself moving through the different levels, each one a radically different environment. So you can hypothetically go up or down an elevator and find yourself moving from a jungle into an equal-sized storehouse of machinery and supplies. In a weird way, it's kind of like wilderness exploration inside a giant dungeon. And while it is a very important game in tabletop role-playing game history, it is also a surprisingly short book, weighing in at only 32 pages. Although admittedly, those pages are dense as fuck. Yeah, if you are only familiar with modern games, this is a little extreme, but not really that unusual for the walls of text you find in these older games. And just because of the age and unusual history of this game, I will primarily be working from the 2007 revised first edition version from Wardco, but will also be dipping a little bit into the 2014 Deluxe Collector's Edition from Goodman Games, using the errated information whenever applicable. And with all that out of the way, let's make us a Metamorphosis Alpha character. So the first thing we're going to need to do is choose what type of character we are going to make, and there are basically 2 options, human and mutation. Well, if we want to get technical, true human, humanoid mutation, monster mutation, animal mutation, and plant mutation. But those are distinctions to be discussed later, and for now, let's just say that we are going to be some kind of mutation. And then we'll figure out which kind specifically later. Because let's be honest here, if I did a Metamorphosis Alpha video and didn't cover mutations, I'd be leaving out the most interesting part. Characters have 6 attributes, each of which are rolled with 3d6. So first up we have Radiation Resistance, which is a character's resistance to radiation. And the way that works is radiation resistance is checked against radiation intensity on a table which determines the harmful effects of the radiation. So, with a radiation resistance of 7, we are unharmed by radiation of intensity 6 or less. Take 1d6 damage from intensity 7, plus 1 per level up to 8d6 at 14, and then at radiation intensity level 15, die. Although there is a 20% chance of just gaining a random mutation instead, as well as a 1% chance per die of radiation damage taken. However, that is just for one round. On each successive round, your effective radiation resistance is reduced by 1, presumably to a minimum of 3, but there's really no reason why you couldn't take it all the way to -5. Next, we have Mental Resistance, which is a character's ability to resist mental attacks, and also some other things. And basically, mental resistance of attacker and attack E are compared on another table to determine a 2-hit number for the mental attack. So, with a mental resistance of 11, and making a mental attack against a creature with a mental resistance of, let's just say, 9, we would have to beat an 8 on a roll of 3d6. And notably, your defensive mental resistance also increases by 1 for each 5 mental attacks resisted. And these two abilities are really a good example of the kind of thing I like about old school games. I love a good set of unified mechanics, but sometimes something just doesn't fit. And in those cases, you can either expand the core mechanics so that it does fit, which leads to a lot of system bloat, or just add an alternate mechanic for that specific thing. You are literally allowed to just have special mechanics for radiation resistance and mind battles if that is what's required to make them work the way you want them to. Anyway, moving on, we now have Dexterity, which determines in what order characters act in combat, and maybe some other things. I will get to that later, and is 10. Then Strength, which increases damage with striking weapons by 1 point per point over 14, or reduces damage by 1 for each point under 7. And with a strength of 8, no adjustment. Then we have Leadership Potential, which just determines maximum number of human followers, as well as the chance of attracting mutant followers, and some other stuff that doesn't really make sense. And we do not get that because mutants just don't have a leadership potential score, which I'm sure will not become an issue later. And finally, Constitution, which determines hit points and poison resistance. So, with a Constitution score of 13, we get 13d6 hit points, so 51. Yeah, an old school game that actually gives you a decent number of hit points. Amazing. Our Constitution of 13 also makes us immune to poisons of strength 9 or lower, take 1, 2, or 3 dice damage respectively on poisons of strength 10, 11, and 12, and die from poisons of level 13 or higher. Yeah, this game does not fuck around with poison, although it's not as bad as you do have 2 rounds to get an antidote if you happen to have one on hand. And if we were making a human, we would basically be done now, but we are not. We are making a mutation, which means we get to choose 1d4 physical and 1d4 mental mutations, so 4 and 3. Except no, because every mutation that has more than 1 mental power must have at least a mental resistance of 12, which we do not, and therefore, I guess, 4 and 1. And this is where we have to get into the weird distinctions between the mutant types. So, as mentioned earlier, there are true humans, who are not mutants in any way, and are therefore not relevant to this whole mutant discussion. Then the humanoid beings, which are the human mutants, and these aren't really 2 different kinds, but the rules do specify that a human mutant with no mutations that affect their appearance will be able to pass for human at the cost of not taking those more powerful mutations. Those more powerful mutations being referred to, once at least, as monster mutations, so that's just what I'm calling them here. Unfortunately, it doesn't really specify what benefit passing for human grants a character? Like, yeah, I know it seems obvious, humans will react to you as if you are a human, but aside from still not having a leadership potential score, which is going to significantly affect how humans react to you, non-human characters are also subject to other penalties, like not being recognized by the ship's computer as a human, so it would be nice to know how far that was intended to go. But let's move on to the mutated creatures, which are just like the human mutants, except that they start as animals or plants instead of humans. And a very important thing to keep in mind with this game is that it is from 1976, and a lot of things are assumed to be understood by the player without actually being specified, or being specified in a way that is not particularly convenient to find. So, for example, without any information, would you assume that a mutated plant possesses consciousness, basic senses, mobility, and the ability to manipulate objects? If you said yes to any of those, you have failed to understand the designer's intent. Mutant plants and animals start as the base plant or animal, just like mutant humans start as base humans. It's just that plants and animals tend to lack certain characteristics that humans generally possess. So in order to have a mutant animal with basic human functionality, you would need to take the heightened intelligence mutation for human level intelligence, and the extra body parts mutation for manipulating hands and speech capable vocal cords. And there are some other issues with animals, mainly what the actual base animal's stats and abilities would be, but those were actually addressed in a July 1978 Dragon magazine article, along with exactly how many mutations you need to take to get up to a human functionality level, so that's kinda fixed. Now, plants, on the other hand, require 5 mutations to get them up to basic human functionality, and I would rather not have to use all of our mutations on just basic functionality, or even 2, so let's just make a regular old human mutant. So we start with a regular stock human and have a selection of 30 physical mutations we can select from, with a few restrictions. Also, there are a few additional physical mutations for the mutant animals and plants. Just kind of felt that was worth pointing out. So let's start with taller, which increases our height up to 25 feet and increases the strength potential of the being, making double, triple, or quadruple the possible damage done by the being, which is the way a lot of these older games are written. But fortunately, this was updated and clarified in an April 1977 Dragon article, which then made its way into the official errata, and is how we will be applying it. So we roll a d20 and add 5 for a total of 16 plus 5 is 21 feet tall. We then gain 1 die, presumably a d6, of striking damage for each 4 feet above normal height, and -1 to striking potential for each 8 feet. And I guess normal height is 6 feet. Good thing we're not anything other than a human, because that would make this way more complicated. So we get +3 dice to striking damage, and -1 to striking potential. Then, well, actually, let's zoom out a bit first. Alright, there we go, that's better. Then let's take new body parts, which is a thing that is even more nebulously defined, but is so because it's also one of the most versatile and useful mutations, if you get the idea of their intentions. Like, some of the examples provided from assorted sources include a heat-sensing organ, tentacles, a poison resistance gland, suction pads, motion-sensing antenna, a water-storing hump, and a whole bunch of other neat things. It is basically the, if you have a clever idea and there isn't another option for it, mutation. But you have to have the idea first. And let's say that we have a projectile tongue, like a chameleon, except that at 21 feet tall, it may have a few more uses beyond just catching insects. And next, let's go with Physical Reflection, which gives us skin that can reflect some kind of energy. And let's choose Radiation because we do not have the best radiation resistance, and radiation can be kind of brutal. And finally, we'll take Heightened Dexterity, which makes our armor class 1. And this is Descending Armor class, so 1 is the highest AC you can have. And for some reason is not listed as being incompatible with Taller, so good for us. And that is our physical mutations selected, but we do still have one mental mutation. There are 37 options available for those, and a lot of fun stuff like Mental Blast and Teleportation, but I think we'll go with Mental Control, which allows us to take over another creature's body. For those rare times when being 21 feet tall could be a slight disadvantage. And there are our mutations. However, we are also given one random physical or mental defect, or both if we have 5 or more total mutations, and hey, would you look at that? We do. So we have Poor Respiration Systems, which affects our endurance and means that we can only fight for 5 rounds without resting or risk passing out, and Fear Impulses for types, and that is just an extreme phobia of something, and let's say robots. That is a thing that may be encountered in this game frequently enough to be a meaningful defect, but not so frequently as to make the character unplayable. And that is it for mutations, unless we want to roll up some unusual body characteristics using the supplemental materials from the deluxe edition. And because that is ultimately my decision, that is what we'll be doing, because, you want your mutant to look mutant-y. And while these additional cosmetic mutations were clearly intended from the beginning, they were never really mentioned in the core book, because a lot wasn't really mentioned in the core book, and as I've said, a lot of times these older games just assume that you know what they intend. But I love some good random tables, so let's get into this. The base chance of having unusual body characteristics is 50% plus 10% per each physical mutation, plus 20% for having 2 or more extremely obvious physical mutations, and I think being 21 feet tall with a chameleon tongue would qualify. So a total chance of 120%. Then we roll a D percentile against that value, and oh wow, how unexpected. We have mutations. Then we roll a D4 and add our total number of physical mutations, including defects, which was 5, so 6 total. Then we have a location table, and we roll to determine the location of each of our unusual body characteristics, and then roll for a specific unusual body characteristic on each of these specific tables. And we have neon blue skin, double-thumbed hands, antennae, scaly skin, a non-existent nose, and long-lobed ears. Now that is a mutant. And just for the sake of completeness, might as well give her a weapon. Club seems appropriate, those are probably fairly easy to make in a variety of sizes, which as a bludgeon type weapon has a weapon class of 3. A thing I will obviously be explaining later. And since mutants are stated to start in a forested area with no material goods, I guess that means this character is done. Which also means that it is now time to discuss the mechanics, such as they are. And just for convenience, I will go over combat first and then get into everything else, or the lack thereof. So let's say that during our adventures through the Warden, a, sky chomper teleports in front of us. A completely reasonable thing for a flying shark to do in this game. And since there is a reasonable chance of surprise here, we will make a surprise roll, rolling a d6, and we'll be surprised on a result of 1 or 2. And no surprise from the giant teleporting aerial shark. Then we need to determine who acts first, which means we need to roll a dexterity score for the Chomper, and 12, which beats our dexterity of 10, meaning that the Sky Shark goes first and does what sharks do. So we pull up the 2-hit chart, and as you may remember from earlier, our armor class is 1, and let's say the Chomper's bite weapon class is 3, equivalent to a sword, making the target that must be hit on a d20 roll 16. So the shark rolls and hits for, let's say, 1d10 damage. And also, let's say that it has the Poison Fangs mutation with a Strength 10 poison, which when compared to our Constitution of 13, deals 1 additional d6 damage for 7 total. Then it's our turn, so we reference our weapon class of 3 against the Chomper's armor class of 5, making the target 12. Then roll, and 14 minus 1 for being very large, but 13 still hits. And I'm going to assume that we can treat our very large club as a larger, heavier mace, which against a mutated creature, yeah, weapons deal different damage against different types of opponent, deals 1 to 8 damage, because the D whatever dice notation was not standard yet. So 1d8 plus 3d6 from being very large for 13 total bonk damage. And now it is the shark's turn again, and since the bite didn't seem to be too effective, it decides to use a mental blast. So we compare our mental resistance of 11 versus the shark's 12 for a target of 9, which must be beat on, remember, not a d20, but 3d6. And it hits for another 3d6, so 15 damage. And that is basically it for combat. Roll a d20 against a number. Basic and overused by today's standards, but at the time there were like less than 10 role-playing games total, so it was novel at the time. The only real notable thing here is the weapon class, because it is notably not just a measure of weapon strength, it is weapon type. And then each type of weapon has different levels of effectiveness against different types of armor. That's really why I'm not complaining about this 2-hit table. It could not be easily replaced with a simple attack modifier, like in other games that use 2-hit tables. Like, I still hate descending AC from an aesthetic perspective, but it doesn't affect the actual gameplay here. As for the rest of the mechanics, I must once again remind you that this game is from 1976, and as such, doesn't really have any core mechanics. Similar to Boot Hill, most of the focus is on combat, with a few stray rules elsewhere. So, there are some very basic rules for exploration, mainly just how far you can move per hour or day over various terrains, and descriptions of the various types of items you might encounter on the ship, and then there are some actual rules for determining if a character can understand how to use those technological items. Which basically involves looking up the complexity of the item. Let's say we found a Geiger counter which has a complexity of 7, and cross-referencing that on the device learning table with our leadership potential to determine the target we need to roll on a D100 to understand the item. So, with an item complexity of 7 and a leadership potential of, oh, yeah, we don't have a leadership potential score. That is a problem. Fortunately, though, it is a problem that has not one, but 2 solutions. If we return to that July 1978 Dragon Magazine article, it acknowledges this as a major issue and suggests fixing it by giving mutant characters an extra technical aptitude attribute, and then using that in place of leadership potential. Although it would really make sense to just give every character a new technical aptitude attribute, but regardless, that's kind of not incredibly necessary, Because if we pull up Dragon number 5 from March 1977, it is just kinda offhandedly mentioned that leadership potential never really made sense and you should just use mental resistance instead. And this is what I'm going to say is the best option because A, it was the first solution, B, it applies to all characters without modifying the basic stats, C, using leadership potential never made sense anyway, and D, this article was written by James M. Ward, original designer of Metamorphosis Alpha, making it more official and also the solution that made it into the official errata. So with a mental resistance of 11, we need to roll a 70 to understand how a Geiger counter works. And that is basically it for the mechanics. Well, the mechanics that are provided. So I guess I might as well bring it up if for no other reason than to deny someone else the satisfaction of doing so in the comments. Yes, with what is provided, you can improvise some basic test mechanics, especially with the clarification that mental resistance is equivalent to intelligence. Like, let's say that we needed to determine if our character could climb a mutant tree to get some special berries that make you invisible to birds. We could say that requires a test of dexterity, and that we test that by rolling a d20 with success on a result equal to or less than our dexterity score. So, overall a pretty easy fix, provided you are already familiar with the basic concepts of roll-under mechanics. And that is the issue. Like, I'm willing to give this game specifically a pass on this because it's from 1976, and as I said, expectations of what were basic features were very different back then, but for some reason in recent times, certain people have decided that this is a feature, not a fault. And weirdly controversial opinion here, you should not be expected to have to make up your own mechanics or import them from other games for basic gameplay features. I am a firm believer that every game, no matter how complex, should be able to be picked up and played by a complete novice. Although I do realize that those same certain people also like to consider inaccessibility to be a feature, and once again, they are wrong. And don't get me wrong, rulings not rules has its place as a concept, but that place is in applying the mechanics, not creating them. You give rules and guidelines for the basics of play, and allow the players and referee unlimited use of their imagination to create new problems and methods of solving them. So, for example, our character has a strength score of 8, and is 21 feet tall, which gives us a plus 3d6 damage bonus, which on average equals the bonus of a character with a strength score of 24. There are no rules saying that this means we can easily pick up an average-sized human, rip a door off its hinges, or carry around hundreds of pounds of equipment without being encumbered. But those would all be reasonable rulings of things that a 21-foot-tall character could do, despite the number on the character sheet still being 8. None of which require us to invent any new rules. Just adjust the baseline of what is an average task for our character. And that is it, I believe, for Metamorphosis Alpha. Not the best game, but a fun game, and honestly, if you're interested in exploring this very early era of tabletop gaming, it is probably one of the better options. The rules, such as they are fairly simple, and more importantly, there's not a lot of them. It is a very easy game to absorb. However, that does mean that it puts a lot of weight on the shoulders of the game master, especially with the mutations. There are a lot of rulings to be made, and a lot of them can result in characters being either unstoppable or very, very stoppable. As for versions, If you can get your hands on it, I would actually recommend the collector's edition. Like, yeah, I have my criticisms, but it's also the most complete version of the game, including all of the Dragon Magazine articles, as well as some other supplemental content. And, like, the Dragon Magazine articles aren't hard to find, it's just convenient to have them all in one place instead of in the middle of various magazines. But, really any version is going to be fine, as long as you remember the thing about replacing leadership potential with mental resistance. And I am probably going to disappoint at least one person here, but this is not the first in a series of Metamorphosis Alpha videos, as, let's be honest here, most people watching probably did not even know that there are 5 editions of Metamorphosis Alpha until I mentioned it right now. No, chances are that if you know the name Metamorphosis Alpha, it is likely due to it being known as the intellectual precursor to Gamma World. And that, if anywhere, is where this is going. And thank you for watching, with extra special thanks to my Fight and Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, Randy Mulholland, and Toshi Rokuro. If you'd like to be cool like them, check out my Patreon, where you can get early access to videos and fun stuff that I make for the Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos floating around screen that either myself or the cold, heartless YouTube algorithm have lovingly selected for you, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.